one of the things that we're all dealing with in medtech, well, if you're a medical device company, is that medical devices need to somehow be connected too, and that creates differences in product development from what people might be used to. So we're excited to have Michael Neidert here to talk to from Zymedica to talk to us about some of the do's and don'ts, things to watch out for when you're incorporating that into your product development cycle. So, Mike.
Thanks, Dina. Oh, I think we got them up.
Yep, but we didn't need to actually switch it. Oh, except now it doesn't want to do that. There we go.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it took 3 more
That's
tries.
important.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks, everyone. Start out with a little bit of a disclaimer. So if you look in your program, this talk was meant to be given by Jan Zukowski, who's our Director of Digital Projects. I think an unofficial theme of this meeting is turning out to be travel restrictions. So Jan developed flu-like symptoms over the weekend. He's based in Boston, so you can imagine how that all went. I'm Mike Neidert. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Development for Zymedica on the West Coast. My background is chemical engineering, which is distinctly not digital products. But I'll do my best to fill Jan's shoes. If you're unfamiliar with Zymedica, we're a dedicated medical device product development company. So end-to-end, that's from ideation through to design for manufacturing and manufacturing. Came out of the Rhode Island School of Design, so there's an industrial design background. And we've done a fair amount of work with UCLA. UCLA is a great partner for us in an advisory capacity, and in some cases, looking for projects where we might be able to help, particularly as you look to spin out ideas out of UCLA into companies and into sort of standalone startups. And when we thought through this particular meeting and what we might be able to add, we thought we would just give a little brief entree, just a brief presentation about the importance of digital product design. It's interesting that we're sort of wedged this time block between two pretty meaty panels. So data handling and privacy, and then investment is right after this. And it's appropriate that those take up that much time. I think in the grand scheme of things, design is not necessarily that complicated. But it does have an outsized importance in terms of adoption and retention. So we just wanted to give a real brief overview. It's what we do at Zymedica, and it is important. It tends to get lost a lot of times in all the other complexities that we deal with in terms of product development. This morning we saw there was one of the projects this morning was a cataract surgery robot. Right, and we've done a fair amount of large capital equipment similar to that. When you look at a system like that, there's a complex electromechanical system, end effectors, imaging. You'll spend a lot of time on those components, but disproportionately, what's going to affect your adoption and usage and retention of a device is the actual user interface. Right, so that's a little bit of why we just wanted to make sure that we gave this quick 10-minute presentation just on some of the watch-outs and things to consider when you're designing your digital system. And none of this is really complicated. And I think as you have the biodesign group here, a lot of those same design principles apply one for one to digital software design, to front-end design. If you think about the history of design thinking and the Bauhaus movement and the idea that form follows function, we tell our clients to think of your digital product design in the exact same way, right? So try to drill down to what it is you want your user to experience. Make sure you focus on what you want that device to do, and really focus on that and make sure that you can do it, right? So when we look at the ecosystem of everything that you have to design when you're building out your digital system, They're sort of your front end and your back end, right? And you really want to focus on what your customer is going to experience, what are they trying to do, and how are they going to experience it, right? So is it going to be on a phone? Is it going to be on a display that's embedded on the machine? And really start there, so that guides your thinking. Really understand the journey that your customer is going to go through and what you want them to experience, and then build your back end to enable that experience. We had a client that came to us. They had sort of a middleware that sat on top of the hospital record system, and it was meant to do a lot of sort of cath lab management and general management tasks. And they were finding that a lot of the system wasn't getting used. It came to us to look at the front end to understand what was happening. And it didn't take, it was maybe about a week of watching people use the system to understand that really what the only thing that they wanted to do with the system was to book OR time, right? And so there were a lot of other functions that you could do, but really 90% of the time what they wanted to do was schedule OR time. But to get there, it took 6 clicks to get to that point, right? And so invariably, they would bag the system and sort of come up with a workaround, right? And so you might think, you have a conception of what you want your device to do, but your users are going to tell you pretty quickly what they think the system does, right? So I'd be open to the feedback from your users and really try to understand how they're going to use whatever it is you're developing. So that's really where we would start. It's like any other sort of industrial design process. Start with something that's not actually the product, a model of some form. So for digital front-end work, we'll invariably start with a PowerPoint or just a couple of pieces of artwork. Really try to map out, okay, if you see this screen, where do you want these buttons? What do you want this to do? Really try to map out what the user's going to see. So no code. You don't really need to have anything programmed at this point. It can really all be done on a whiteboard. It can be done with slides. If you have an existing system, then I would go to the user. I would try to see how they're using the system, what their workarounds are, and really try to understand what their day-to-day routine is and what they're actually trying to solve, right? It's going to get to what your device is actually doing. And then build out a map, right? So this is the map that we want to follow, and this is the trajectory that we want our users to experience. And that should define your minimum viable product, right? And so especially as you're a startup, it's probably the most important thing that you can do is really try to identify what the minimum product is, right? Because that's going to define the scope. The more you put into the front end, it's more that you have to code, it's more that you have to document, more that you have to test, more that you have to debug, right? And so there's a real, I think more than anything else, put the effort in up front to understand what that scope really needs to be. Still understand kind of all the other features that might come into it later. That's going to affect the scalability and sort of the next level of things. So you still want to be able to include those user needs later. But at least for the first product, I think one of the things we would always tell our clients is to really understand what that minimum viable product needs to be. The next step from there, is moving on from MVP, from the minimum viable product, really trying to understand, and not so much understand, but making sure that you build in enough flexibility in your system to scale up, right? So when you look at the architecture, you've got your map, you've got an idea of what your product scope needs to be, what the minimum viable product needs to be. Now you can look at what the infrastructure is going to be. What's the back end look like? Are we going to go with Azure? Are we going to go with AWS? Are we going to go with Google Cloud? How are we going to design the database? How are we going to design everything that goes into the back end? You should have all of this feedback from your users on what the most important thing is, but then some idea of, well, in the future, we might want to have this functionality or this functionality. And so that's the point where you really want to make sure that you have enough flexibility built into your back end to allow for that. It's really impossibly difficult sometimes to pivot. You look at some of these large enterprise software solutions. If you're trying to pivot at a certain point, it becomes incredibly difficult. The inertia that's involved to make wholesale changes can be pretty difficult. I think at the startup stage, you've got a lot of latitude to be nimble, but it's one thing you always want to keep in the back of your head. Similarly, when you're thinking about scalability and how this is going to go from an idea to an actual product, you want to keep in mind maintenance. It's not sexy, but it's something that you're going to need to keep in mind. In particular, you're going to want to understand who's going to be doing the maintenance. So are they contractors? You're going to need to give them access, or do your customers have on-house staff to do it? And you'll want to understand how complicated it is, for your system to be updated, because you'll have contractual obligations to provide service, right? So the system can't be down for a particular length of time. And the last thing we just hit on, I don't really need to say much more because the panel that we just covered, or the panel that was just up here, did a phenomenal job covering the issues of security and privacy. But it's, I think I would rope this in with the regulatory strategy in general, right? So those three buckets of, user-centric design, scalability, and then your regulatory concerns. You're going to want to have the user needs documented, and you have a validation plan from the front end standpoint. But then you also should think about cybersecurity, have a cybersecurity plan, and data privacy, particularly if you have multiple users, right? So if you're going to have some users that can have de-identified or have identified data, and some users that have de-identified data, it gets a little bit complicated. So you want to make sure that you have your privacy compliance buttoned up. So that's really most of it. Like I said, this is kind of the amuse-bouche between two meatier topics. We'll have the investment panel next. I just wanted to close up with an example of sort of how this is all rolled together from our own lives. This was a concept project that came to us where a company was looking at newborn fever. So newborns really can't thermally regulate very well, and so temperature is not necessarily a good indicator that a fever condition exists. So they were looking for some other way to communicate, to recognize the signs of fever, and then B, to communicate that to parents. So we took a step back, did a fair amount of basic research looking at all the variables that we could measure. It turned out temperature is an important metric, but also signs of respiratory distress, so respiratory rate and heart rate, and then irritability, which we measured with motion, right? And that all got piled into a machine learning algorithm, which is pretty complicated, right? So there's a lot going on here that the end user doesn't care about and doesn't really need to know, right? So just talking to focus groups of parents, kind of across geographies and different sort of different family groups, it came out what they really want to see is, show me what the variables are. Like I do care about knowing what the data is, but then give me some idea of what to do with that data, right? In this case, it kind of gets back to the 23andMe example that was in the previous panel. You can't make a definite diagnosis. The best that we can do at that case is to say something along the lines of, the conditions exist that may indicate fever. There has to be some language. You have to basically give a soft alarm, but that would be generally how we showed the information. The other interesting thing when we went through the focus groups was that the parents wanted to have their data next to it, right? So in the blue was the newborn, and the green was the parent. And this was a situation where, in that phase of development, bonding is pretty important. There's a lot of bonding going on between the parent and the newborn, and they really wanted to see their data next to what they had for the infant. So really trying to keep it simple. I think if you asked us, we probably would have tried to get away from even showing the data and making that another screen. but the users really pushed us in this direction that it was important to show the data as well. So that's all I wanted to go through. I'll take any questions if you have them. I'll answer them the best that I can. I'll probably just direct you to Jan. Yep, thank you.